So we're going to move into our final panel discussion before we go into our final fireside chat. And it's looking very much at private sector-led investment. How exactly has that worked? And what can we learn from the experience of investment by the private sector in South Africa and in Africa? So I'm delighted to welcome back to the stage. Chris, please join us up on stage. We also have Ken Osei, the Principal Investment Officer of International Finance Corporation, which is a member of the World Bank Group, Sub-Saharan Africa. Please join us on stage. We also have a newly minted WTTC member, Hamza Farooqui, the CEO of Millat Group. Please join us on stage, and thank you for making the last members call. That was great. And we have joining us from Zim, we have Tendai Madziwanyika, the Group CEO of Rainbow Tourism Group. Thank you very much for joining us, sir. Wonderful to have you here. So we've had a full day, gentlemen. We've been talking about all the opportunity, all the inspiration, all the possibility of investing in Africa and investing in South Africa. And it is absolutely huge. However, Chris opened up an important point when it came to investing in South Africa and investing in Africa. And one thing that's always been lovely about the Honourable Minister is her truthfulness and her saying, listen, this is a situation, this is what we need to do. Now, interestingly, all four of you are perfectly attired for my next question, because clearly there are times when investing in Africa and South Africa has caused you to pull your hair out. So thank you very much for being on spec. I'm very grateful. I didn't think that was going to happen. From that perspective, if we look at, and you were very good, Chris, in, the pandemic was one thing. Let me tell you about what other challenges we faced. When you are speaking to potential investors, the opportunity is huge. But what do they need to be ready for? How can they simply understand, not just from a financial point of view, but psychologically, this is what you need to prepare for? Because the reward is massive, but also is required a muscle to be able to do the honors. You're shaking your head. Tendai, tell us, please.
Well, thanks, Anita. And what an honor to, kick off this panel.
This hairless panel.
This hairless panel. In fact, I was just sitting, when I came up here, when you mentioned it, I looked and I thought, none of us needed that Deepak hair gel at all. So it's quite interesting. But yeah, I think your question, Anita, was, what do, investors need to be aware of on the continent? And I think that for us, I think the whole aspect of Africa, the cultural nuances, as well as the policy frameworks, understanding local, the local business environment. And I think that in order to manage that space, it's very important that there's a good relationship between, the international investor and the locals that are in that particular jurisdiction. So I believe that what we need is to be, as Africa, very positively engaged with international investors, international financiers, and give them that local knowledge.
Brilliant. And I think to your point, give them the local knowledge, not apologetically, but simply from the point of view of this is what the EQ is required to be able to get the ROI on the continent. Brilliant. Hamza, from your perspective, please.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. To dive really in bluntly and sort of candidly, it's beyond, I think, cultural nuance and EQ. The international investor today is super sophisticated. Capital allocators are allocating money on travel and tourism in a massive way. So let me tell you, there is no shortage of money. There is no shortage of the challenge where we have in Africa, and it's not a South African problem. We've been unable to attract institutional capital at scale, right? Because let's look at South Africa today. And sometimes when South Africans go outside of the country, they love and learn and appreciate their country even more. And I travel the world, and when I come back every time into South Africa, it reminds me of the strong value proposition that South Africa presents itself. The challenge we have as entrepreneurs is access to capital isn't there. We then bang on government's door, but it's not government's job to provide capital. Government is simply there to create and play the policy part. We've got to figure out how do we bring institutional global capital at scale. Again, you can try public policy government, and yes, the GCC is a market, but those GCC investors are super sophisticated, right? They're deploying capital in their own economies. Go look at what Saudi Arabia has done in the RIA. Go and look what the UAE is doing in their own economies. So by the time that capital allocation comes into Africa, it's pretty much at the end, it's half-hearted, it isn't there. We need to move institutional capital and bring real institutional capital. And that's in the form of appropriate private equity capital. The problem, again, then you have, to attract that capital, you need capability, right? And that capability needs to be beyond just capability around, I know cultural nuances. It needs to be intentional. You need to make sure that skill force understands service, experiential, and there's that depth. Again, South Africa's big plus point is our people and our natural predisposition is there. Go travel into Europe, go and travel into the US, it's great, but there is that area of tiredness. Come into South Africa, the guy naturally smiles. He actually is willing to help, but he needs the finishing touch. He needs the training. So in my mind, the big challenge here is everyone needs to know the knitting. Policy, capital, capability. And if we can orchestrate that with intentionality, and if we can be unconditional about doing it with a real concept of service, then I think these forums, these shops will all lead to execution. And that's my honest hope and desire.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because ultimately, confidence is a currency. And when you bring that all together, the capability, the intentionality, the opportunity, there's no question. There is always risk in pioneering. There's greater risk in not recognizing the opportunity to be a pioneer. And that's why I think it's very interesting that having Ken on the panel as well from an IFC perspective, because you have organizationally a global perspective as well in terms of how to make things work and why it's worth the risk. Please.
Thank you very much. So South Africa and Southern Africa has a very compelling tourism proposition. You've got the entire one Atlantic coast, the entire Indian Ocean coast, a lot of things in between. And frankly, compared to other regions of the world, there are not very many that have the same level of value proposition. Now, somehow that's got to be monetized, shared with the world. The second aspect is what Hamza spoke about, capital. So currently, I think we have a tendency to want to look just to international capital, right? But if you think about it, in Southern Africa and South Africa, there's a lot of money that's going to pension funds. There's a lot of money that's going to insurance companies. We also often think only of leisure tourism. But if one looks at tourism more broadly, it's not just hotels. It's everything from events, sporting events, cultural events, gastronomy. So there's a whole issue around how we define tourism, business tourism. It's not just in between the Formula Ones. There's a lot of things, sports. So if we start to broaden our thinking around what is hospitality and tourism, it's a very, very large asset class. Finally, the area of making sure the right type of capital. So folks want to do projects and are looking for debt. The projects are not yet cash flow generative. That's not the appropriate form of capital. Long-term investors, insurance companies, pension funds, want to be able to put assets to work for 30 years. They are good partners for long-term infrastructure. The short-term funding is not suitable for that. So trying to match the right type of instrument to the infrastructure that we want to support, to the type of assets. Now, compared to the rest of the world, I mean, if we look at other areas, you look at Thailand, Vietnam, a lot of other countries have basically monetized with relatively little in terms of the asset. We have to find a way to monetize what this region has. The last thing I want to mention is taking a hub and spoke approach. So South Africa is a long-haul destination. So coming to South Africa, one should be able to package opportunities to visit the Victoria Falls, to visit, the Namibia. I mean, to create almost like a circuit that will enable leisure tourists, business tourists, to benefit and take advantage of what's on offer.
Absolutely. And especially to your point, because for so many travelers, this is long haul. And that's where, Honourable Minister, your announcement of the e-visas was so important, because it unlocks the opportunity to go here and go there and go and add it on. Because ultimately, it's, if we don't leverage the siblings in the family, the whole family will lose out, ultimately as well. Chris, from your perspective, please.
I think to your comments, international institutional capital is a challenge. I mean, a fund manager sitting in London that's going to deploy $10 million to a hotel portfolio on the Mediterranean with existing yield versus investing in a greenfield project in South Africa is always going to be a tough sell, right? But certainly the capabilities are here. I can only speak from our experience. The South African professionals are world-class, and we can export services and goods anywhere in the world. Club Med has actually taken the entire supplier list from this South African resort to their global portfolio, saying that our furniture and fittings are world-class, cheap, it's reliable, there's flexibility in ordering, etc., etc. So the capabilities are here, no doubt. But I think international institutional capital is a challenge. Often, internationals will require local guidance or a local partner for that case, which is something that happens all across Africa. And I think that's where you can sort of bridge that gap between, how do we invest in this new destination, or how do we invest in a country like this with political risk of X, Y, and Z? But if you've got a capable local partner to sort of navigate the waters with you, I think that makes life a little easier.
I'm curious, because I think importantly, when the Honourable Minister of Economy and Tourism from the UAE spoke, and focusing on South-South and South-South development. Now, he has beautiful hair. We don't want him to lose it in the process of it. But they're very keen on venturing in, which is fantastic. I'm just playing devil's advocate here, and I appreciate it wasn't part of our briefing. How much of it is, it's not just about convincing the world to invest in Africa and South Africa. It's actually about convincing Africa and South Africa that it's worth us going out seeking that investment. That's what I've always felt from the point of view of whether it's BRICS or whatever it might be. It's a partnership. It's not just one coming in and breaking in land and taking over the opportunity. They want to know, what can we give back? Tell me, you're shaking your head, but there's clearly a sense of, oh, we're not stepping up to the opportunity. Please.
I think it's a hugely important point, right? Because again, if you take just pension funds, and not to call on any institution, but the Public Investments Corporation of South Africa has a balance sheet of about $160 billion Rand equivalent. The second largest pension fund, EPPF. There's a lot of institutional capital that is sitting on the African continent. It must first deploy local, must show belief in local to a certain degree. In fairness, there aren't very many opportunities that are aggregating these pools of capital. We're also not taking advantage, perhaps enough, of creating the financial instruments, the financial markets, to bring all of this capital to work. In the end, we end up being somewhat frustrated, right? Because the capital is saying, I'm looking for good projects, and the projects are saying, I can't find money. So somehow we're missing each other. Absolutely. Something is missing in this dialogue. And maybe that's an area we need to sort of try and facilitate and address. Is how do we bring capital and projects together? And maybe increase the understanding for the projects of what capital is looking for.
Absolutely. I must say, Hamza must never, ever, ever play poker, because your thought bubbles and your expression when he started were brilliant. Clearly, you would like to add to Ken's point.
No, I think maybe it's the entrepreneurial authenticity, right? When you've built a thesis and you funded it with, on your own, you understand and you've gone through the cycle. So Ken is right. South Africa has a very deep institutional, and he's spot on. but it's difficult to access. Let's be frank, right? Meritocracy doesn't exist in South Africa today. To get into those pools of capital, there is a political dialogue, there is a political dynamic, it's challenging, it's complicated. As an entrepreneur, I don't have the time to sit and read the tea leaves, right? So I've got to go solve for the solution on my own. And that's why sometimes global capital, smartly done with capability, is better and easier. And if the local institutional player wants to come, then they must come. Hopefully organizations like the World Bank and IFC, my view is, should play a role in mobilizing and getting those pools of institutional capital think. South Africa does have a very robust institutional, it does. But the challenge is they just don't mobilize. The challenge is they just don't understand. They sit on the fence. Corporates in South Africa are sitting on piles of cash. There is enough money, so he's right. But they just don't mobilize. So what do? Do you just sit and wait for them and keep on banging the door, figuring out the political tea leaves, or do you go out there and find an alternative? For us as Millat, today we're the largest owner of Hyatt-owned operated hotels, PropCo, OpCo capability. We've just launched the world's smallest park, Hyatt in Johannesburg. We've done that on our own balance sheet because we believe in the country, we believe in the ecosystem. But we're not going to wait for institutions in South Africa to understand the thesis or political groupings or pieces, because that's entrepreneurs don't function that way. Capability doesn't work that way. Someone has to solve for that, and I'm hoping someone will. But whilst that's happening, there is a global world where there is large private equity pools of capital who are willing to make calls today. One thing I want to say, this country has the DNA of tourism. And I want to pay, we forget this sometimes. The world today talks of leisure experiential. It's South Africa, it's a guy called Sol Kerzner who made, right, all-inclusive leisure in the 70s popular. That same DNA today sits in One and Only, Atlantis, and all over the world today. So I think there is something special here. But again, we need to pick up the pieces, we need to start executing, and I think we've got to find a platform where we can merge policy, capital, capability, and build it. If someone can fix the pools of institutional capital in South Africa and make it accessible to entrepreneurs without having to read the politics, that person would have solved a big problem.
But you make a good point, because the fact is, the politics is there. It's interesting, because Sol, very wisely at the time, especially with the barriers during the political climate, worked through government to find ways of getting the labor to come in from one area to another when before they weren't able to. We have an ACE card in the form of the Honourable Minister of Tourism. How, if at all, can government assist in that convincing of those institutions to start unlocking that access to capital? Is there an opportunity? Did you find that there was some way of being able to partner with government rather than government sitting and saying, but why isn't this happening? Question to all of you.
Yeah, I guess, Anita, from our side, we found a lot of assistance in government. To Hamza's point, you know, the majority of our capital is domestic, but it made me old. I mean, it took so long to get through that system, and it is very hard to access. But various government departments really assisted us on this project. You know, whether it's Department of Home Affairs for foreign visas or Department of Tourism, who have got a lot of colleagues in the room here. Local municipality, it is a challenge. Infrastructure is a challenge. Visa access is a challenge. Funding is a challenge. There are various challenges, and you have to navigate them. Otherwise, you know, you're doing everything off your own balance sheet, or you are spending a lot of time talking to various people to get very little done. Indeed.
And from a Zim perspective?
Yeah, thanks so much. I'd like to sort of expand that into sort of an African narrative. You know, I think, Hamza, you touched on the whole aspect of international brands. I actually think that we need to be more realistic as Africans. Africa is going through an evolution. It's going from, you know, small little establishments into establishments that must be globally relevant. And how do you do that? You know, we recently bought MSK House in Buitengracht Street. And what was very clear to us is that if we come here and we say RTG, nobody's going to take us seriously. They're going to say, what is that? Do you sell oils? Do you sell paints? What do you sell? And in our trying to understand how do we really optimize the opportunity. We realize that global brands don't want to take positions in African assets.
Because
they want to focus on what they do best, which is ownership and deployment of their brands. And so what we think is one of the ways that business can actually optimize, the place that Africa finds itself, is in actually coming up with some form of relationship with international brands and seeing them as partners rather than competition. They're not. You see, because they're not going to go and invest in a hotel room. They're not even going to take a lease. But if we can work with them and say, listen, we either own the building, we take a lease on the building, and then we deploy their brands. That way we enter that space. And at the same time, we have an international brand that is actually prepared to work with us to develop an Afrocentric brand. Mm-hmm. Because you see, what's happening right now is you've got all these individual properties that are trying to do their best with their branding, but no one knows them. But if we can partner with these international brands, develop brands together, co-own those, and deploy them across Africa, I think that gives us relevance, that gives us access to their GDSs, access to their loyalty programs, and so forth. And I don't know if you know this. We've done some research that says in Africa, there are 56,000 properties, hotels, on the continent. But the problem is, as I've just said, we're going through an evolution. Who are those 56,000? We've actually gone into them. We know exactly where they are and their configurations. But the thing is, we're so fragmented. So one of the things that I'd like to talk about is the fact that we need to find a way as operators, as owners, to come together and mobilize capital at scale. Because your earlier question was about mobilization and why is the capital not coming? We're too small, And again, if we think of just South Africa alone, we need to integrate, one, in terms of the properties, and secondly, in terms of the region. We need to sell sub-Saharan Africa, or at least a greater part of sub-Saharan Africa, and get scale.
But and it connects beautifully to your earlier point as well. By taking those local brands, marrying them to the international brands, those local brands understand how it works on the ground. So if we look at someone like, for instance, Adrian Gardner, when Accor bought Mantis just before the pandemic, which was fascinating because it wasn't just that the industry changed through the pandemic, the travelers changed. And suddenly, Accor had this golden ticket of these eco-based destinations that travelers were now looking for. Because I think, Chris, in many ways, Club Med, I'm a big believer in it's not just the message, it's the messenger. And you, in many ways, are the canary in the coal mine for other international brands who are serious about looking at South Africa, Southern Africa, Africa for development. And the canary came out alive. Came out without any feathers, but it came out alive, so that's all good. There is no question that those international brands will create a curiosity of other brands saying, I don't know what's happening, but if Club Med is prepared to invest, I need to look more closely at that. Have you found any competitive energy and interest going in your direction?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, historically Club Med's been a pioneer in, the Caribbean and elsewhere, and we've certainly had a lot of interesting interactions with large hotel groups from around the world saying exactly that. If this is good enough for Club Med, we want to have a look at it, or, we're interested, or we've seen, some other large hotel groups getting involved in game reserves as well around South Africa now. So it's there's definitely an interest, there's a pioneering spirit, and from a business point of view and from a country point of view, you want that to happen. You want that market to grow and for more and more and more hotel groups or resorts or interested businesses becoming involved. But it takes time. It definitely takes time. And I think in our case, a lot of these interested parties will keep an eye on what's going to happen next year with opening and how the market responds. Yes. And can South Africa handle it from an infrastructure point of view? And can King Shark accept the guests of the capacity, which, of course, there's lots of capacity, and hopefully it sends the right message.
Indeed. And interestingly, a right message to international travelers as well as South Africans. Because as you mentioned, the Club Med brand is very much respected and adored by the South African market. And to the point where a girlfriend of mine who used to live in Durban is now living in the UK, as soon as I went to your website and doing the prep for this panel, I actually sent her the link, knowing that, oh, when she comes back to visit her family, you might want to plan this in 2026. Because I think that's important, is that with the domestic tourism growth, and again, full credit to Mother Nature with the pandemic, domestic tourism was always the poor cousin to international. But with the pandemic, people recognized this is our home, and there's so much we can do right here. Having now these brands also makes people's backs straighten with pride. So there's a lot to be done there. What I'm intrigued by as well is the fact that you went up the coast. Rather than bringing in the property into already developed and saturated areas, you went further up. And as you said, in terms of the impact on crime dropping, because there was a lack of joblessness, double negative. But that's beautiful, because those are the types of cases for investors that these developments become little engines for that socio-economic impact that lifts up the baseline right over, and that goes to our previous panel. The question, though, is what next? What next? What do we need to be focusing on? And as I've challenged everyone for next year's summit, how do we push this conversation? You shouldn't be the, sorry, I love you all dearly, however, you shouldn't be the exceptions. You shouldn't be the only ones who see something. How do we get people to understand, look in this direction, because you're missing out if you don't? What will you say?
Anita, to answer that, I think that you touched on something very important about the effects of COVID and what it did for us to have self-belief in a way. You know, in our group, our numbers are showing that arrivals from Africa actually went up by over 100% since 2022. In fact, 100% above the highest level pre-COVID. In other words, we started focusing on the continent. We started, saying, how do we work with the African Union and the other regional blocs in order to, get business from there. So perhaps what I would see as an addition next time would be greater focus on what's happening out of Africa. Maybe some more, I feel very privileged, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Honorable Minister. But maybe a couple more, on the panel. I saw a large panel earlier. Maybe a bigger panel and with a bit of, representation from beyond South Africa.
Well, that's where we're going to use you as a champion to let people know you missed out on the summit yesterday. We need to bring you back. Yeah. But it's an important point, because I think the respect of African travel by Africans is fundamentally important. Yeah. And that's where, if we don't demonstrate and champion the beauty and the value of it, why should anyone come back? Hamza, from your perspective.
So I think a strong domestic tourism market is an essential. Fortunately, South Africa has that, right? The other part is a strong South Africa leads to a strong Africa, right? And that's not being sort of saying the rest of Africa is second fiddle, but South Africa's strength, its infrastructure, its sophistication, its depth in institutional capital markets should position it as a gateway. Whether you now increase length of stay, you improve product, that's all optimization, right? The average traveler going into Italy sees Europe, Schengen. America does that. We do need to start doing a better job of seeing ourselves as Africans. But I think we need to make sure that we get some basics right. We need to sort of drive that. And I think the robustness of strong domestic demand, and by the way, I think domestic demand is going to get even more stronger, because that young consumer today sees what the rest of the world, they're seeing on social media the vibe. They want to be in a nice branded pool spot having a cocktail. So that generation is going to want more. That consumption pattern domestically is going to want more. It's not just only the little person who's taking one holiday a year. This is going to become, but do we have product? Do we have the capability? Do we have the global brand? And I think that thesis then resonates itself. So I think that dovetailed. And I think the point around global brands is relevant, right? But you then need to be a good Uber driver. So I take the best of the technology, I take the best of the brand, but am I a good driver? Am I delivering customer centricity? All of those pieces. So I think for me, it's going to be about execution. For me, if we can understand the play between policy, capital, and capability. And again, I'm going to stress, if there is real depth and capability in a market, the capital will come. The capital will come from places because the world is in a global space of uncertainty. And I think travel as a sector and as the impact it creates is so powerful that I think is going to happen. And I'll end on one last thing. I've said this before. Mining was a big play in this country. I think tourism is the one sector which will create not just jobs, but will deal with the issues. But we need to be intentional, right? If you look at the tourism budget in this country, it's probably one of the smallest because it's seen as, and that needs to change. If there's one sector which is going to do that, and I think that's where policy needs to be beyond just visas and access, where there needs to be intentionality, right? At the leadership level, highest level of leadership, that this sector is going to create the jobs. And I think that if that's there, capital is pieced in, and there's strong capability, then I think this part of the world is going to be the next frontier, is the frontier.
I have to say, listening to you speak now, and I'm thinking of Adolfo. Where's Adolfo? I can feel now why the WTTC is so excited to have Hamza on board as a because I think what's really important about that, if we pull this together, and I'm going to pivot slightly now into a different area, but it is recognizing the fact that we need to be the ones championing the case. And the case needs to be, shame, you should come and support Africa. No, it's a do it now or you miss out. Because but there needs to be, again, that understanding and that alignment.
Yeah, and just to be quick, the Global South is there. Asia, traffic moves. So I think all of those dynamics speak again to that narrative. But I think if everyone can stick to the lunchbox and the knitting and execute and sort of have a real sense of purpose behind it, then I think, with God's help, I think this thesis, story, and what sits, I think is going to work just fine.
Right. And so to that point, when I say I'm going to pivot literally in that direction. Because if you were to look just down the street, you will see one of Africa and the world's best convention centers. And that's why I loved seeing in your presentation that you had the whole meetings, events, MICE market in there as well. Because that's one sector that we don't talk about. We default and talk about leisure. It's all about leisure, all about holidays. We are institutionalizing the risks of seasonality. We are institutionalizing shorter stays. The Honourable Minister was incredibly smart in saying, okay, we have everyone coming here for the G20. We're going to take them up to Skakusa, but how do we detour them to a tourism investment summit? Bring them to Cape Town as well. How she had the ability to get Mother Nature to turn the cloud on the mountain and keep everyone in the room, that's a whole different thing. But I think that the MICE market is fundamentally important, or business events, conventions, etc. And I think Senthil's back in the room. We'll have him back on stage. That's a huge part of it. How do we bring that into the conversation? Because if you look at countries like Kenya, South Africa, Rwanda's done it brilliantly with their convention center. How do we start bringing that in? Because there's massive ROI when we bring in the business event side, which now is very much, corporations are happy saying, go for the conference, stay a couple of days and play. How do we do that? And your commitment to it, I'm curious, Chris, from your perspective, and the conscious investment you made into facilities despite your proximity.
Yeah, it's a very big market. I mean, that sort of 400 to 600 pax conferencing facility. The challenge, it brings its own challenges. I mean, you don't want to be turning a hotel over every day. So, you want them to sort of stay 2-3 nights and then maybe add on some leisure time after. But it's, we've seen real interest in the MICE product. I didn't even mention it, but we're constructing a 500-seater conference facility on site, and there's strong demand. We often talk about hospitality just from a leisure point of view, but that business side does create seasonality. It takes the seasonality out of your cycle, and it does create significant market for you.
Because I would argue that that's where, as well, the risk is mitigated for investors because it allows the momentum of engagement. And especially when you marry it to major sporting events, we saw it during the World Cup, that as if by magic, all of these conferences from around the world happened to be booked in the middle of South African winter when the World Cup was being played. Who knew? And you think, oh, that's very smart, because it's about leveraging that opportunity rather than simply having people in and out and then you don't get the ROI. Ken, what are you finding in terms of, is there interest growing in that niche that is fundamentally important to keeping tourism as a whole strong?
Well, I think you find this actually as a trend globally, right? So just give some specifics. The city of Las Vegas, for example, mysteriously in January hosts some of its biggest conferences because it's right after the festive season when people are sort of all spent out, right? So that's where the corporates go in for conferences, etc. The city of Las Vegas has joined the Formula One circuit, but it's positioned in November during a quiet period. So using events, MICE, to fill in the various cycles in the tourism cycle is something that we should be looking to do more of, right? I think you mentioned the Honorable Minister getting folks to Skukuza. I mean, if you take South Africa, I mean, you can come to Cape Town, within 2 hours, go to Kruger, within 2 hours, go to Durban, go to Namibia, you know. So to create this sort of mix between MICE, meetings, investments, and conventions, and leisure tourism, so they build off of each other. During the break, I was talking to Jerry and the team about God's Window, and I said, well, if you put a hotel, you'll have both a destination and experience, yes, and the two will feed off of each other. So the ideas that we can really exploit to take advantage of both sort of the meetings, conventions, as well as leisure events, right? Sports is another big one. So you don't have to host an event physically to actually have tourism around it. Saudi Arabia has been hosting in the last year events around everything from gaming. I mean, you imagine that gaming is actually something you go and experience, right? Not everybody's gaming, but people go and watch that. Anime conventions. So to come up with new products that take advantage of the existing infrastructure is an area that one can really sort of exploit. Absolutely. To monetize the assets.
Because I think, and to your point, and this is where I would ask Senthil on the next session about the confessions within the MICE industry. The events become an alibi to be able to visit some place you've actually really wanted to go. You just can't, you just have to look as if you're suffering and it's really hard work, but I happened to stay a couple of days. That's, again, coming out of the pandemic, companies are saying, do that. Stay a couple of days, stay on Wi-Fi, that's all we ask, and it's great. So interestingly, Tendai, because I want to tap into something that, going back, now we have a few minutes. When I first came to the continent in 1991, I came through Malawi. I was with Unilever, lived there for 3 years, and I remember visiting Zim. You had the Flame Lily tours, which was a spectacular model of flying into Harare. We went Harare, Vic Falls, Wangi, Wangi back to Harare. And I remember thinking that, my goodness me. And that was a time when Zimbabwe was a case study of magic when it came to tourism development. That's the way to do it. How do we unlock that magic again? Because it's the connectivity, as you were saying, that's vital.
I think, Anita, this, when I was listening to Ken talk about, you know, Kruger, Cape Town, Namibia, I almost interjected. I almost said Vic Falls. To just say, you know, we just need to lessen the fragmentation. We need to increase the borderless access. We need to, you know, take away the visa restrictions. We need to ensure that, you know, airlines do a lot more long haul directly into certain destinations. You know, we were talking earlier and realized that, you know, you have about 98,000 people flying out of Harare into London, and yet there's no direct flight. So it's things like that to say, how do you look at those things and make ourselves, you know, we mustn't be apologetic.
Yes.
Let's create more access. Let's integrate our destinations a lot more, and let's work across borders to create those packages that someone gets surprised that, you know, in the days when Zim was really not the toast of the world, you know, South Africa did us such wonderful favor. You know how? Because a lot of times they'll package the Vic Falls, and a lot of the guys from the States and Europe didn't know where the Vic Falls really was. And then they'll sort of realize when they arrive in the Vic Falls that, oh, we're in Zim. They're like, oh, really, in Zim? Yeah, you're in Zim. Because South Africa had actually just packaged in Zim into there. And that's the way we need to do it. We need to become more confident in ourselves. We need to integrate ourselves and realize that we are stronger together. And we need to create one region that, you know, becomes more relevant and becomes economically viable in the world.
Indeed, and that's why what's important about what you're saying is that it might not be your problem. Yeah. The solution might come from Home Affairs. It might come from the Ministry of Transport. It might come through aviation. But we have the champions to be able to have those conversations and unlock those barriers. Hamza, I'm going to give you the last word in terms of what's the secret that you all share that people need to know about unlocking opportunity for themselves by getting here to the continent?
You know, I think there's two things. The day we realize that, you know, this country, this continent really has God's very special grace. The day we actually really, with depth, and as human beings understand that in real terms, unconditional terms, then I think we'll understand that our business is actually about how we make people feel. And I think if we can do that, then I think we'll be able to solve for a lot of the issues, whether it's political challenges. The world is not easy, right? South Africa and Africa, the challenges it faces is not South African challenge. The world is not an easy place, but the ability to face it resiliently and I think to deal with it, I think is what counts. And I think we're very fortunate to be in this sector. We're very fortunate to be in a sector where we can care about people, we can care about how they feel, and if we can make them feel, then I think our countries, our destinations, it's the intersection of national pride, excellence, the movement of humanity and how we make people feel. And that's what makes this sector so compelling. So when financial investors talk about return social impact, there is nothing more powerful and moving than I think our sector. But we need scale. We need execution. And my fervent hope and desire is that the coming years bring about that execution. Because if Africa doesn't get it right, the challenge, unfortunately, is it will get left behind. There is a big world. Everyone is fighting for destinations. Everyone is fighting for market share. And I seriously hope Africa cracks that code. And I think that there's a growing responsibility, and there needs to be a greater resolve and sense of purpose to make that happen.
Indeed. And it's interesting because I have to say, and thank you for saying that, it links very much again, Chris, to what you said in that story you shared, which I just loved about how when you looked at the crime rates dropping because of the employment in the area, I'm not sure if Michael's in the room, but Gavin Tolman, the Tolman families are absolute champions when it comes to tourism in Africa and in South Africa and across the world. And I was interviewing Gavin on one occasion, and he said to me, he said, Anita, no one wakes up in the morning and says, you know, today I think I want to be a criminal. No, it's necessity. And you take that away and you bring back dignity and purpose and possibility for families and a sense of we're going to be okay. And then you marry it to a nation that is so excited about its tourism. And it's basically saying, we're going to be okay because we want the world to see how much we care about ourselves and about them. And to your point, Hamza, the world's a pretty unhappy place in a lot of places. It's great when people can come here and not just see the beauty of South Africa, but feel it deeply. Because this continent is a calling. We just need to turn up the volume and the confidence of our calling out. So, ladies and gentlemen, please thank our gorgeous panel.